Hey pals, welcome to a new video. Today, I will be answering a very simple question that I get asked quite a lot on Twitch and on YouTube that has quite a dense answer. It's not very easy to answer this question. And the question is, what's a good canvas size? This is a question that a lot of beginner pixel artists inevitably face. And I think actually the answer is quite deeper than you might think. So let's get started, shall we? Okay, what size should I set my canvas? This is a really difficult question to answer right off the bat with something simple, because pixel art is something that is not just one thing, right? If you are engaging in pixel art, you could be doing it for a number of reasons. The most obvious reason could be making some art, right? It doesn't have to be for any particular purpose. You just want to make something pretty and you like the style and you want to get invested into the style, so you start. Art of this size doesn't need a particular canvas size, as long as it's within reason and something that you can populate the canvas with. You can set it to whatever size you want. Then there are the people who are trying to make games, and they're looking to find a resolution for their game, which is a completely different question. Still inside of the game context, we could be talking about asset sizes. So how big should my canvas be if I'm doing a character, or a tile set, or a background? So here, I want to talk about not just like what a good size is for each of those scenarios, but why you might want to pick a certain resolution, or what are the factors that would go into choosing a larger or a smaller canvas and the dimensions. So let's begin. So the first thing that I want to say is that pixel art is art, and just like any other kind of visual media, the goal is that you are trying to, fill the canvas with creative decisions. Right? And that can be fewer decisions or more decisions, which creates your composition. And the same is the case in pixel art as any other. In pixel art, of course, there is the minimum, which is that, you have 1 pixel. But the maximum in terms of the detail and the size of those details is completely up to you. And in this first case of using pixel art just to portray artwork, right, just to draw something or represent something visually, not in a game context, you can see that there's a lot of range here and a lot of scope for, the artist's style and their intention to be executed and represented on the canvas, right? So there are so many choices going on here in terms of composition, lighting, color. We've got application techniques, we've got pixel art techniques like banding, and we've got dithering, we've got all kinds of decisions that are being made and executed on inside of the canvas. Now, the tricky thing here is that the size of the canvas is kind of irrelevant to the quality of the work. These artists are both very experienced, and the images that they've composed are very artfully created. And so when we look at the techniques and we look at how these works are constructed, there's really no way to compare a beginner artist to the work here. I can't say to you, like this art is a lot easier to create because it's smaller. That's obviously not the case. And as a beginner, what you're looking to do if you're starting out is just get some kind of direction. So what I can say about canvas sizes is that when we're doing art like this, larger canvas sizes require probably a better understanding and command over negative space. So the bigger your canvas is, the more important it is for you to make decisions about where the detail is and where it isn't. Larger canvases allow better representation. So, this is a really realistically rendered helmet. And if you're a beginner, you may not be able to draw that, whether it's pixel art or not. So having a much, much smaller canvas or smaller details can kind of mask that lack of, rendering talent that you may have and allow you to get started creating things earlier. But as you get comfortable with a smaller canvas, you may find that your growth is limited. So if you're working in a tiny 16 by 16 canvas, maybe you can draw some interesting, character figures. But eventually, if you want to start exploring some of the techniques that we can see here on display, you won't be able to really practice those in a tiny canvas. You're going to have to start increasing the size. So we've got 2 canvases here. They're both within the sort of 100 to 300 range in each dimension. I would say this is generally speaking, quite common across pixel art for scenes, okay? And this is including games. Let's talk about some games. Pixel art for games is like another world compared to pixel art for the sake of just art. We can see here there are completely different constraints around showing, user interfaces, text on screen. We've got characters versus backgrounds. We've got assets in the scene like tile sets and sprites and buildings, trees, stuff like that. And those are all represented in a way that the developers expect to repeat. There's no real custom element to how these details are being rendered to match the scene. It's mostly just, content being placed and positioned in the screen that was created in smaller canvases, right? A screenshot is really a combination of, dozens of art assets that were created in their own canvases. Now, of course, game art, just because it's in a game, doesn't mean that it can't be art. This is from that same Zelda game on the Game Boy. And this is some bespoke art that was used in sort of like an intro cutscene. All right, this is the same 160 by 144, but we can see all of those constraints about sprites and the sizes of that. That all goes out the window, and we can just sort of render whatever we want. What I will say is that for game art, the big difference between this and the knight that we were looking at in the previous slide has to do with the fact that the Game Boy had a limited palette, right? The biggest difference is that when you're drawing something with a limited palette, there's not as much opportunity to blend the pixels. And so the details, the very smallest details, at best can be represented by one pixel. And because there's no room for subtlety, it makes it much, much more likely that the art is going to be created with line art, right? We can see here, Link's nose is a line of pixels, and there's a little bit of shading, but we wouldn't really be able to represent this in a softer way given the palette depth, right? We need those contrasting lines, and we need those bigger shapes to be able to represent something like this with this palette. And palette depth is really, really important in this conversation. To really hammer this point home, I want to talk about palette density. So we have the Knight that we were looking at by Cyan. And if we look at the palette, we've got 21 colors. The color in this image is representing a very small part of the color spectrum, right? We're not looking at the entire gamut of color. We're looking specifically at a very, very narrow range of browns and golds and silvers, okay? And the image has a lot of opportunity here for blending of color across multiple pixels to represent details, okay? So if we zoom right in, you can see here there's a stretch of about 8 pixels or 7 pixels where every color is different, but only slightly so. And as we zoom out, we can see that what that represents is a kind of anti-aliasing on the lip of this eye slit here. And so the details here can be much, much finer, right? I mean, even looking at the background here, there's a lovely subtle dithering and cross-hatching here that creates this soft focus and a kind of like a vignette moving away as we go to the borders of the canvas. That level of subtlety would not be possible if it weren't for the canvas being so dense and narrow, okay? By comparison, if we look at Link's Awakening here on the Game Boy, it's the same size canvas, right? It's almost the same size. And in fact, if we look, the pixels are the same size, but it looks so much more constrained, right? It looks like there's just no opportunity for any details of that size. I mean, part of this is the fact that there's only one subject in this image, right? The guy takes up, 3/4 of the screen. Whereas here we're looking at a scene and none of these elements can take up 3/4 of the screen. But also we don't have enough colors to really represent subtlety in any of the elements. Okay, and if we look at the scattering of these colors in the spectrum, the proximity of these colors at best is, you might have 2 colors that are close together. Compare that to the previous image where every color is almost overlapping, right? They're so close together. And so because the distance between the colors is so high, the contrast is really high. And again, we're forced into this game of trying to create line art, right? You can see the outlines of these trees and the outlines of Link's different components that make up the body. And so regardless of the canvas size, there's just not an opportunity for the detail to be there. So we're comparing two images here. One very, very advanced, another probably a lot easier for a beginner to do, but the advanced one has a smaller canvas size. It's really hard for me to say to you straight up, like, bigger canvases are for more expert artists, because that's just not what we're seeing here. It's more to do with the representation of images, of what we're trying to portray, right? The density of those details and the way that resolution and color depth, right, especially color depth in this case, can actually expose or show the potential for better artists to make more fine and refined choices, right? So that's the difference. If you're a beginner and you're working with a simpler palette and a reasonably small size canvas like this one, then you will most likely be sort of shielded by the fact that you'll be pushed into doing line art like this, but you'll also be limited by the fact that the line art is never really gonna get you all the way towards this, right? Eventually, you're gonna have to start thinking about how light reacts with materials as you increase the fidelity and depth of your palettes as your experience grows. So I told you it would be complicated. Okay, so we've looked at this very, very high level, kind of what a general canvas size is, but let's take this from a different angle and talk about characters. Okay, a lot of you are really interested in making, say, a side scroller or a character focused game. Let's try to tackle the problem from that direction. So the question of, what should a canvas size be for a character is a much easier question to answer for me, because there are so much more clear constraints around why you would make a character a certain size. Here, we've got a lovely set of characters from different indie games in the last 10 years, with my own in the middle. You can ignore that one, that game's not out yet, but the others are all released. Okay, so we're looking at games from Celeste all the way to Blasphemous, and you can see here the sizes are quite drastic. There's quite a difference. Basically, the way to think about this is, in classic pixel art games, in classic systems, most images were most practically sized in powers of 2. Okay, so a tile for a game might be 8 or 16 or 32 pixels. In the same way, a lot of the characters would be sized inside of canvases that are those powers of 2. So for Celeste here, 17 pixels tall, but vaguely sits inside this 16 pixel space. That's what you would call like one tile. And then you can see we've got like a much closer set around the 32. Obviously, any character larger than 32 pixels would be designed in a 64 by 64 pixel canvas, but that's generally how things go. So for me, definitely when I'm working on a character, I will pick a multiple of 2 or a power of 2, and I will draw the character in that space. You can see Armin here from Insignia and the character from Iconoclasts, I think it's Robin, are pretty close. This is about the 48 pixel limit around here. And then we've got larger characters like the character from Rogue Legacy and the penitent one from Blasphemous. And we're heading outside of 64 here into the 128. So generally speaking, player characters sit just around or under that 64 limit, down to about 32 pixels. It's very common. I'll explain to you why that is in a moment. This isn't the limit for all kinds of characters, right? We have things like larger enemies or bosses. They can be as large as the screen, right? There's no real limit on these things once we're talking outside of the scope of player characters. So let's think about the practicalities of these player characters. With the exception of the first 3 examples, every other game in this list has this exact screen size. It's the same resolution. It's 640 by 360. Okay. The former 3, so Celeste has half of that resolution as the base. It's 320 by 180. Stardew Valley scales, and Momodora has quite a slightly smaller resolution. That's 4 by 3 aspect ratio. We're going to be talking about that all in a little bit, but suffice it to say that the on-screen size of these characters relative to the screen ranges from about 10% to about 20%. This is really important. There's a reason for this, okay? The most obvious thing, and we covered this in like one of the first episodes of this series, the most obvious thing when it comes to creating a character is the space that they occupy on screen kind of sets the tone for the entire rest of the game. So the character speed, the jump height, the size of platforms, the size of buildings, all of those things need to reflect and be scaled appropriately relative to the character. And if the character is too large, then you're effectively forcing yourself to draw the game from a zoomed in perspective. And when the camera is zoomed in, because the on-screen content is so large relative to the screen contents, then you don't really have a lot of space off screen to allow things to show up on screen and give the player some heads up. If the player is this big on screen and they're in the middle, you only have like 3 or 4 bodies worth of space for new enemies or whatever it is, obstacles to show up, right? So the actual reaction time of the player is affected by how large the character is in that extreme example. On the flip side, if the character is too small, then it's hard to see them on the screen, right? It might actually be really difficult to spot them and to keep track of the character. So this 10 to 20% range tends to be where things go because it gives you like quite a lot of space either side of the character. You can have a lot of height. Platforming is quite comfortable. It's a very comfortable middle ground. Now I can talk about this so confidently because, like I said, most of these games use the exact same in-game resolution, right? That gets scaled, but essentially the constraints around what it's like to build a side-scrolling or top-down game or any kind of game in 2021 are the same. So let's talk about why. Modern screen sizes, so the devices that we use to play these games on, are all very, very similar in resolution and in aspect ratio. Whether it's laptop, desktop, TV, mobile phones, tablets, handheld game consoles, most of them share, if not resolution, a very similar aspect ratio. Aspect ratio defines the shape of the rectangle, okay? How square or how oblong it is. The most common aspect ratio for all of these devices is 16 by 9. That's 16 across by 9 tall. It's not exhaustively the case, like not every device uses that. A lot of tablets and laptops can be 16 by 10, a little bit taller, and a lot of phones are a bit longer, mostly to make way for things like status bars and extra stuff. But the content that you watch on them, generally speaking, most video is exported as 16 by 9. Now the most common resolution in that 16 by 9 aspect ratio is full HD. You might know this as 1080p. The P stands for progressive. That has to do more with the way that the pixels are rendered. But in general, the 1080, that describes the height of that resolution. So 1080 pixels tall at 16 by 9 gives you 1920 across. And this is, in the last decade or 2 decades, the most common popular resolution for, pretty much anything. It's a standard, okay? It's not the only standard, there are others. Prior to 1080p being, across the board, whether it's phones, laptops, and everything else, we had a smaller resolution when widescreen first began. That was 720p. That's still quite common today as well. The Switch has a 720p screen. And we also have Ultra HD. So that's 4K, which is double 1080p. I want you to notice that the ratio between these 3 screens is not a common step, right? Like Ultra HD is double 1080p, but 720 is not half of 1080, okay? So we didn't just double the resolution every time. It's kind of more like 2 to 3 to 6. So they're all the same aspect ratio, but they're not the same resolution and they're not in the same common multiple. So it's obviously very important if you're a pixel artist, when you're trying to make a game for one of these resolutions, it's really important that the art scales correctly, right? So that one in-game pixel translates to a clean integer of on-screen pixels, whether that's 4x or 6x or whatever it is. You don't want some pixels to be smaller than others. And so you need to be able to divide this screen up in an even way such that the art resolution, which is definitely going to be a lot smaller, something like this, multiplies by a clean number, right? 3, 4, 5, whatever it is, to fit perfectly inside these boxes. That's the challenge of the modern pixel art developer. So, where do we start? How do we make sure that our art is a reasonable size for these resolutions, for these screens, that doesn't look way too small and feels kind of retro? So the first place that you might go looking would be the generation of consoles that came out, that were the last pixel art consoles before we got modern indie games and before we were working with digital displays. So here we're looking at the Super Nintendo and its output resolution. Unfortunately, this is a terrible place to look for an answer to this question because the Super Nintendo had neither an aspect ratio that mapped correctly to most TVs at the time, nor a resolution that multiplied correctly into that aspect ratio or that resolution. Instead, what was the case was that because these are analog TVs, the way that the pixels get rendered is not based on pure pixel sizes. There aren't like a certain amount of pixels on the TV that the system is rendering to. Instead, the resolution describes sort of how long on screen a light is shone, and so the pixels themselves can stretch or squash in a way that feels quite clean. And additionally, because these monitors are quite soft in the way that they render the pixels, there's like a natural kind of wash over the screen that blurs a little bit the difference between them. So unfortunately, we know what the resolution output of the Super Nintendo is. It's 224 pixels tall, but these were shown on monitors that had mostly 640 by 480 resolutions and had 4:3 aspect ratios, when this is 8:7. So basically, don't look here. This isn't going to help you, especially as a beginner. So if we want to actually be talking about pixels and pixel sizes, the easiest place to go is handhelds, because they have proper pixels in their monitors. We have like LCD screens, right? And the first place we can look is the Game Boy, or the Game Boy Color in this instance, where we've got 160 by 144. This is quite a square ratio. I mean, it's almost a square. It's probably like 8:7, like the Super Nintendo. But at the very least, we can count the pixels and we can see the details here. From here, I would take a look at the Game Boy Advance. The Game Boy Advance has 240 by 160, which is kind of heading towards widescreen, right? The aspect ratio is getting there. And these numbers look like they might scale quite nicely up to our resolution of 1080p. So you're probably going to do one of two things, right? If we're going down this road, you want to get to 1080p and you want to start at a resolution that looks like something that you played on a retro console. The first thing that you might try to do is start at 1080p and start dividing by halves, or pick some division that's like one of the smallest multiples of 1080p. Now, if we divide 1080p by 8, we get 240 by 135. This kind of looks really close to like a widescreen version of the Game Boy Color, right? These are really close in size, and we've got a bit more width, obviously, to fit that 16:9 aspect ratio. So you would think maybe this is a good place to start. If we multiply this by 2x, we get 480 by 270. If we multiply it up again by 4x, we get 960 by 540. That's half of 1080p. And if we go up by 6x, we get 1440 by 810. That's not really a resolution that helps us. And then 8x, we get 1920 by 1080. Okay, and so literally 8 across and 8 down, right? 64 multiples is how big this resolution is at this scale. So you could effectively take this art, put it in this window, multiply it by 8 in each dimension, and you would get something that's 1080p. There's a problem here. The problem is that we never touched 720, right? At this scale, 720p sits somewhere in here, right? We couldn't get there with clean multiples. If we multiply by 5, we wouldn't get there. By 4, we don't get there, it's too small. By 6, it's too big. So you would have some situation where the pixels would need to be squashed or stretched in an uneven way, and it would look like crap. To prove this to you, we're going to do what I just described. So let's take this resolution. This is 160 by 144. So we'll go 240 by 135. And we will just take this here. Maybe we'll just... oh, you know what? We could just duplicate it or flip it. Let's do that. So we'll take this, paste it, edit, flip horizontally, and then just line it right up. So from here, we're trying to get to 720p. If I take the sprite, change the sprite size to 1280. 1280 by 720 is 533.3%. Okay, so something's not going to line up here. If I press OK, and we start looking at these pixels, you know, it looks kind of okay, but something's going to go wrong every few pixels, right? The width of these ones here, that's 5 pixels wide. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But this one is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pixels wide. So something's going wrong where every so often we're going to get one of these bands that's wider than the ones next to it. And specifically when you have characters walking through those regions of the screen, you're going to get weird situations where a character's eye might be, you know, half the size as his other eye, or you know, all kinds of crazy nonsense. So it may look okay from here, but it's not ideal. Okay, especially if you can help it, you wouldn't want to make this decision for your entire game. So we're going to pick something else. Let's pick something that's quite close to the Game Boy Advance. Let's go 320 by 180. So we're going to add 20 pixels just to the bottom of this screen, and we're going to make it a bit more wide to fit proper widescreen, and that's where we're going to start. If we multiply 320 by 180 by 2, we get 640 by 360. If we go again, we get 1280 by 720. There we go. So that's the switch done. And old TVs that are widescreen. If we go up again, but to times 6 this time, we get 1080p. And then obviously we could just multiply this by 2 to get 12x, and that's 4K. So essentially, this is the answer. This is the way that you should do it, and the way almost all modern pixel art indie games do it, because it's just the sweet spot. Right, we have a resolution that at the smallest scale, and this is Celeste's native resolution, at this scale, you get small, kind of lo-fi, handheld looking pixel art. It looks pretty close to the Game Boy Advance's size, but it scales perfectly to 720p and 1080p and 4K. And if you double it, then you get this really nice hi-fi version of pixel art, where you got a lot more pixels to play with, and it also still scales to everything else. So you get something that's the best of both worlds, essentially. So this would be used for something like Celeste, and this is used for like Owlboy and all of the others, Blasphemous, that kind of thing. So if you're looking at making your own pixel art indie game, the really easy answer for me to give you as far as where to start with a canvas size is just pick one of these two. If you want to go simple, pick this one. If you want more advanced, pick this one. Easy peasy. The next question you would obviously have though is, okay, but now I want to start, you know, creating my art and everything else that goes with it, all of the different canvases for, you know, characters, enemies, buildings, that kind of stuff. How do I determine those things? I cannot stress this enough. If you're going to be coming up with the look and feel for a game that doesn't exist yet, the first thing you want to do is come up with some sort of vision piece, okay? Come up with a mock-up where you're allowing yourself to build a palette, to think about the play experience, right? From the player's perspective, when this thing's released, what does it look like? How does it feel? That's going to give you a really good experience and sense of direction on how many colors your palette uses, what's the temperature of that palette, is it cool, is it warm, how big are the details, how big is the character on screen. Be prepared to change these things. But from an art direction perspective, like we're talking here as artists, not really developers, this is the way that you approach this thing. Do a mock-up, play with it, see how it feels, and then proceed from there. Instead, as a developer, you want to be doing like the opposite of that. You want to be talking about hitboxes and the size of the camera and that kind of stuff. And so if you're a solo developer, have fun fighting between yourself on how to do that. But as artists, this is a lot easier answered by just creating your mock-up. I can only talk from my own experience here, and I will do that now. Armin, of course, his size is 52 by 22 pixels, but that's not his canvas size. That's the size of the content. If I want the character to be able to animate and move their arms and legs and run around, stuff like that, the canvas needs to be bigger than that. The hitbox itself is about 48 by 16 pixels, so the hitbox is a bit smaller than the character for collision, that kind of thing. Which puts us in a situation where, okay, if you're going to be using my power of 2 rule, we can say 64 by 64 works, okay? This is what I use. This is an actual screenshot of my basic animation set for Armin. In Insignia, I have lots of different sprite sheets for the character. Some of those for combat specifically are a lot larger than 64 by 64. Like swinging a sword may breach the bounds of this canvas. Most modern engines don't care about this, right? Having like some character sprites be much bigger than others is not a big deal if your animations are in different assets. So my sprite sheet, when I export the game, every animation for the character, idle, run, jump, they're all in different sprite sheets. And so all that really matters is that the canvas size for each of the sprite sheets is as big as the content needs to be, right? It's just, it needs to fit the content so it doesn't get cropped off. That's all that really matters. I would also advise you to stick to a multiple of 2. If not a power of 2, like 64, 32, that kind of thing, then at least a multiple of 2, something that divides by 2, an even number. And that's mostly because of pivots, right? Where the character's chest is, the center of gravity. If a character is on a canvas that has an odd number of pixels, so 65 pixels, then the center of the character would be straddling 1 pixel. And if we're talking about the x-axis, right, like where the character's feet are, then the character's feet will be sort of like halfway through half of a pixel on the ground, which may cause jittering. It could do all kinds of stuff that you don't want. So that's the size of my character and the character canvas. But what about any other asset that exists in the game world? For literally every other asset in the game, the first thing that I do is put the character in the canvas. So I put Armin in the canvas, and then I draw whatever I'm drawing relative to his scale. And once I'm sort of comfortable with the general proportion, I'll put both of them in the game and take a screenshot and see how that feels too. So in this situation, this character is a lot bigger than Armin. He wouldn't fit in a 64 by 64, so I put him in a 128 by 128 just to give myself some room. And in fact, his combat animations are even wider than that. I think they're 144 wide, something like that. But as far as the game is concerned, all that really matters is that it's to scale, right? It doesn't matter how big this canvas is, as long as it fits the content comfortably and we're making sure that it is compared to the character favorably and makes sense to us visually. That's all that really matters. You know, this goes for other assets in the game, like buildings, you know, things like how big a door should be. You can't really answer this question without the main character, because if the main character is going to be walking through it, then that's the only most important thing in the game, right? Everything is scaled to the player character. And you can, you know, give yourself some empty space. Sometimes I start with a canvas that's like way bigger than I need. I draw what I need, and then I just trim the canvas to fit. Okay, it's not like, you know, it's not rocket science, and the canvas size that you set when you start the file doesn't have to be the canvas size that you set towards the end. And some canvases that I make are actually bigger than the screen. Okay, so this tower is a building that I created a few years ago for the game, and its height is actually taller than the game resolution. So in game, you only get to see about this much of the tower when you're on the ground level. But there are other scenes where you can see it from a different perspective. So there's a scene where you can stand up in the tower and you see this part of it. Okay, there's no reason why you can't do that, you know, and this is totally fine. We live in a generation where even the weakest consoles, even the weakest systems that you would use to play any game on, can handle large textures like this very favorably. Zero impact on performance. Things like empty space is completely negligible in terms of memory sizes, because we're working with like gigabytes of RAM here, and an image like this is like a few kilobytes. Okay, so you could have millions of images like this being rendered, and we're not really having to worry about it. As far as like the game size, and at runtime. So, I hope that's answered most of your questions. I'm not sure to what extent I think people who ask me, what size the canvas should be, would be satisfied by this video. I hope I've given you some direction. As a final note, I just want to say, I think one of the most important things when you're learning pixel art has to do with getting around the intimidation of building large things. When you're a beginner, it's really, really common that you may think that you will have to painstakingly place every single pixel, one point at a time, to fill the canvas. As you develop your skill set, this question of how big should my canvas be becomes less relevant because you will learn to use the empty space more favorably. Okay, when I first drew this building, the first version of it was one of the first things I did actually when I started the project. The first version of this building has roof tiles across the entire roof. The entire space is full of tiles. Okay, this version, I'm not even drawing one tile. It's like an edge per tile. But you still look at it and can see it, for what it is. And in fact, the fact that there's so much negative space allows you to really appreciate the character more because the details on the building aren't pulling focus. So the thing that I want you to think about as you're improving and getting more experience with pixel art is trying to graduate from this idea that when you're doing pixel art that every pixel needs to be filled with detail, and instead thinking more about where the details should be. That's probably the biggest lesson that a more experienced artist has over a junior artist, and it's where your style as an artist will start to show. So where the details are, not how many there are, and how you express those details, that's the sign of somebody who's confident with the art form. That's something that I'm working on, always getting a little bit closer. You've been watching me work on that for the last few, dozen videos. So I hope you'll continue to join me for those videos, and I hope you'll continue to engage and embark on your journey in pixel art. And I hope that you have no troubles picking the size of your canvases. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one. Hey pal, thanks for watching, and thanks most especially to the patrons and Twitch subs who support this channel and my game dev project Insignia. To find out more, click the links in the description below. And if you like this video, tell YouTube by clicking the like button, and then YouTube will tell me, and then I'll make more videos. That's nice. Thanks again, and until next time.